Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
I'm trying to share my screen. Sorry about the late start. I had some problem with my Zoom application that it wasn't showing the upcoming meetings and I had to restart it. Sorry, trying to find the right screen to share. Share all windows. There it is. Share. Let me know if you're able to see my screen now.
Yep, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Okay, let's get started. Just first of all, an announcement. I've managed to successfully publish our community meeting calls onto YouTube. So I've posted the link to our playlist. You'll be able to find all the videos, and going forward, I will try to upload it the next day when the Zoom recording is ready. Let me know if you have any issues. At the moment for the description, I've just linked our repo and meeting links. And out of all the videos that I've posted so far, I think it's just interesting to point out the recording with people in the thumbnail have better views. Just a finding. And on the actionable agenda items today, I've just listed the 2 open PRs we have. So the first one is the certificate load for the Notary plugin. So Teja pointed out that we might need to limit the number of files or depth of the nesting of the directory. And Sajay said we can log an item and improve over time since it's a user provided path for now. Teja, are you okay with that? Okay, great. And Teja, I do have a question about the CSI driver. So my understanding with the certificate load that you can provide the certificate and mount them, or we can retrieve it from Key Vault. I saw some configuration in the secret provider YAML file in the chart. I'm just sharing it on the screen right now.
Yes.
That we're referencing the secret store CSI driver, and we have sample configurations for how to specify a certificate from a Key Vault. So my question is, has this worked? Like, have we tested this?
Yep. Yeah. It's a tested thing.
That's good.
Will not check in that one. Yeah. It gets mounted into that specified folder from where I think the configuration can pick that certificate. Yep.
So with the implementation for this PR, we're given a path that we will read all the files. If the certificates were mounted through Key Vault, if there were multiple certificates in this array, then that code path theoretically will read all the objects in as well. Is that correct?
This one, no, I think it's, no, I think there is some gap here. This one is just the list of secrets that you want to read from Key Vault. That array represents a list of secrets, I think so. And where we mount it, if we can go back and see the configuration where we mounted this Key Vault secret into our service somewhere. Is that the deployment? Ratify deployment or somewhere? Where is this keyword?
It's probably a volume mount in the deployment.
Yeah. If you go down, Docker auth is one mode. What's the other mode? Yeah, AKV config is enabled, right? It is mounted to the. It is mounted to that path. Ratify certs, and the only cert that gets mounted is that cert name ratify.cert. So if the Ratify is able to read this folder, and I don't know how it does it look for an extension. How does it know which file is a cert and which thing today? Do you have any filter on the extension?
Today we try to read it in as a cert file, and the cryptography utility would be empty if it was a non-certificate.
So you read all files under this folder and then you give it to the library?
Yes.
And have that validate if that is not a valid cert file?
Yes, let me bring up the implementation here. These are just tests. So this file path walk will bring in the path to the specific file, and we're using the cryptography utility to read in the certificate file.
Okay, and what does this method returns empty means?
So I tested, like I was wondering if it was reading a TXT file, what would there be an error, or how would it behave? So if it was a TXT file, then the certificate object is empty, but the error is also empty. So we're basically just moving on to the next file.
But then you're adding that cert to the certs array, even if it is empty. Is that what?
Yes, I could add a check here because it's empty, so it doesn't add anything.
I see. Okay, yeah.
So I was
question, if you're reading the folder, then it will read all the certs under it. Yeah.
Yes. So I was wondering, with how we do the CSI, if there were multiple certificates in the key vault and we mounted them to the same directory, then theoretically we will read multiple certificates in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
I should validate that. Sajay, we talked about like how do we read the certificates in from key vault, and I think like I found some configurations related to the CSI driver. So I'm just checking with Teja to see what is the status on. So yeah, so it looks like it's handled, and if we have configured multiple, we should be able to read them in. Okay.
But today the CSI is configured to read only one secret.
Sorry, come again, Teja. Your volume
CSI,
is a little low, maybe.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Increase my volume a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you well.
Yeah, that CSI is secrets thing, right? Today, I think we only read one secret. If you see in that array, we just read one secret.
Yep.
If you want to read multiple secrets, then I think that has to be changed.
I see. The deployment file, is the purpose of deployment file more like an example? So if the user were to really use Ratify, that they will expand on this deployment YAML and they'll be able to specify multiple certificates?
Yes, the whatever is the CSI, yeah, the key vault configuration, right here, this is the array. The current one is because previously Ratify used to read only one cert. I think that's where these files were written in that way. But if this has been expanded, I think you can provide another example where you can load multiple certs from the key vault.
Yeah, I will try that out. And the other question is, currently we use the pod identity, and Akash was letting me know that they just released support for workload identity. So is it, what's the priority on switching to workload identity? And the advantage if we switch to workload identity, that it aligns with how the ORAS authentication workflow that we've just added. So then we're using workload identity at both places.
Is it a question to me or like?
Oh, just the general, like,
Oh, I see. Okay.
do we feel like, how do we feel? Do we feel like we can switch to workload identity when we need to? Or for the consistency sake, we should switch to workload identity so we're using the same workflow.
If this is a supported scenario in CSI in the keyword, I think I don't see any concern in changing to workload identity.
Yep, sounds good. I can, since I'm going to try out the multiple certificates anyway, so I will try out the workload identity properties as well. Yep, okay, so are there any additional comments on this one, or can I get a sign off?
I guess it's more of a style thingy, the last comment, which is if the cert is empty, don't add it to the list. I'm not going to pick on that, but it's up to you to kind of like, for readability's sake, add it only if it is not, if something is valid in there would be just a
I would prefer adding a warning or log
Right.
statement if you have encountered such file rather than just blindly skipping it or assuming on the language it will not add to the array.
Sure.
I just have from a performance standpoint also, you're calling an append method, which you really don't need. So it's a very minor optimization, but it's still worth it.
Sure. I will push an update. Oh, yes, I have an additional question with the release process. So after this change is merged, if we were to update the, if we were to update our example with the Helm deployment, what's our release process in updating the tag? So at the moment, I think we install Ratify and we pull the image from this repository with a specific tag.
Right.
And how do we previously update the, who have access to push to this repository?
I don't remember if I wrote up the docs for releasing this. Do we have the docs for this one?
Is it under docs?
Should be. Typically that's, if we haven't, we should write this up. Your question is pretty valid. We don't have an actual release process in here.
Yeah, I can sync up with like who knows about the release process.
Yeah, if you want, you can take a look at, I'll point you to something where we just recently wrote the release docs for this from a process perspective. It just helps create this tag, push this branch, update the workflow. I think we need just a set of things so that anybody at least understands if they want to do a fork and they want to release their own, but it should be easy.
There need to be a release.md, right? If I understand in the Ratify, we don't have that.
I thought there was. I've been writing release docs for like multiple projects. So
Can you go to the root Ratify?
Yep.
What does the releases.md mean?
Oh yeah. Okay, good.
I was assuming that was the one of the first documents we have.
Yeah, okay. I did author this, so it's fine.
Sounds good. I will follow this and release a new version after I merge the certificate from directory.
Yeah, that'll include the workload identity fix also, right? That's merged in. I think that's Akash's change.
Yeah. It's good that you brought that up. I forgot to add it to the agenda to talk about the refresh strategy. Sorry, I'm just gonna add it here. Auth refresh. Okay. Yeah, we will. Thanks for bringing that up. We will talk about it later. Oh, Sajay, just in case you don't see it, I've uploaded the playlist to YouTube. Check it out. Okay, the next item we have is the ORIS Authentication Documentation. Let me close these tabs. I'm still going through this file to try to follow it through and been syncing up with Akash. Akash, is there anything that you want to talk about for this PR?
Nothing in specific. Thanks for the reviews. I've kind of gone through and tried to make it more human readable and easier to follow. And there's a lot of steps for workload identity specifically. So any other comments would be greatly appreciated. But yeah, just gonna resolve some more comments, and then hopefully, Susan, if you can follow through and actually finish it to completion, then I know that the steps are good enough for anyone to use.
Yeah, I'll let you know once I've followed through.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for adding this documentation. Yeah, our next item that I just added, the authentication refresh strategy. So Teja pointed out on the previous PR that the secret themselves can change, and also talking to Akash said even for the workload identity, the token itself on the pod can also expire or change. So I just want to go through, like, in general, how do we deal with the expiry of the secrets or tokens. One of the items that me and Akash brainstormed is if we use the credential and we were unable to log into the registry, we could then try to refresh. And Akash also mentioned the RSV2 API have like a ping mechanism that we can validate if the credentials are valid. So we want to see how people feel about these options.
Is there any notification system in Kubernetes that we can subscribe to for any changes in secrets or something? I'm just asking in general. I don't know the answer.
I'm not sure about that.
So is the question, how do we find out if any secrets change, and how do we refresh credentials in our cache?
Yes, so basically right now we use a registry client cache so that we don't have to keep calling the provide method to get the credentials every time. So once you create the client, then subsequent calls can just use that client to connect to a registry through ORIS. But we have an expiry that can be used for that cache. So if, for example, the AAD token for workload identity has a 24-hour expiry, we track that. So we can check, okay, it's expired, and then we'll force the whole re-cache of the credential. But there might be situations where the token might be invalidated, or the credential might be invalidated. So in the Kubernetes secret scenario, if it got updated and we're not aware that it got updated, we'll still have the old credentials. And then yeah, so basically, how do we know when to actually refresh beyond the expiry date that might have been set? So one way would be that every time there's a cache hit, you also ping, which might be, defeating the whole purpose of the cache at that point. or the other point is if it fails for any of the operations. So the first operation we usually do is to resolve the subject descriptor. If we get like a 401 error, then we know, okay, we need to go back and redo and get a new credential. So.
And what is stored in this cache? The actual credentials or the tokens?
It's essentially the credentials, because we create an ORS registry client, which all it does is hold the credentials.
Credentials means the username and password.
Exactly, yes.
Or the empty GUID and the token.
So that is the empty GUID and the token. Those are the username and password that we use. So the 000 GUID and then the refresh token that we get during the AAD refresh token exchange.
That token expires in 3 hours or so, correct?
I don't know when that expires. I know that the AAD token that we first get, that expires in 24 hours.
Refresh token also has some expire unless something has changed on ACR. I don't know, but
yeah.
This is, however, an Azure specific issue, right?
Yes, yeah.
I don't think we should solve
not
it.
Azure. This is ACR specific.
Okay.
ACR empty GUID and refresh token.
Right.
So, you
So
mean the Azure related thing?
Okay.
For the Ratify, it is Azure related.
Correct.
ACR related.
Correct.
Okay.
So if we were to solve this should not kind of like,
yes.
Are we solving for common refresh problems, or are we solving for a specific issue that is in a cloud provider? So I think you need hooks to be able to refresh, but you also need to be able to kind of like handle this within respective cloud provider extensions, however you want to do it. Is that what we are discussing?
I
I think what's the
discuss
refresh
one at a
strategy for credentials cache, at least my understanding is what we are discussing.
Yes, the general strategy for refreshing the cache. So if regardless of if it's the Azure specific, or maybe in our case, the Kubernetes secret, for example, would be a generic scenario where we wouldn't know.
So today, what is the cache expiry policy? So we put something in cache, definitely it should have some expiry, right? Is it just time-based expiry?
Yes, it's just time-based right now. So it's currently set for 24 hours if we're using workload identity. And then right now for Kubernetes secret, there's actually no cache expiry even set on that. So it never expires.
Do we need to solve this problem now? Or as long as we use workload identity, that's okay, because I think isn't workload identity a Kubernetes platform capability? It's not a cloud specific capability, but there's integration with every cloud, right? Or at least that's the pitch.
Hold on, I think I'm trying to understand here. We are putting something in the cache without expiry is a question I'm trying to understand here. Because cache itself is temporary, right? Anything we put it, unless it is used as a database, that's a different point here. I know workload identity, we do have a cache, but in one of the scenarios, I think we put in the cache and it never goes away from the cache.
Yes,
that's something that we need to address, or there is no concern there.
It is a concern, especially if it gets invalidated, how long in the future it does. So a quick fix would be to set some arbitrary expiry on it, so maybe 24 hours again here, or 3 hours or whatever, and then so it'll be forced to do it. But longer term, what Susan and I were thinking was, if there is a failure, we can just re-trigger the whole refresh process and it'll go grab the credentials again.
So today, just to clarify, Akash, like if there was username and password in the Kubernetes secret and the password got rotated, what's the behavior right now?
The behavior right now is that it would have already been cached and there's no expiry, so it'll fail. Yeah.
Got it.
So, because I haven't set an expiry on it either. Wasn't sure what we should do with that. So That's a pretty quick fix if we just want to go like a Band-Aid fix right now, to just update so it expires every 24 hours or something.
And so these credentials we're talking about rotating, these are to the ORIS registry, or?
Yes, yeah, to the credentials needed to access the registry.
At least I would suggest we'll have some expiry on the cache.
Yep.
Maybe that could be configurable. So somehow users can have control, but that's a second point. That's not a main thing. Now, the thing that we are trying to optimize here is how do we proactively refresh the credentials if secrets change, right? Rather than just time-based expiry.
Yeah, we can
So-
also look into if there's any notification. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Well, I was trying to think through this, and I apologize for my ignorance, but I'm trying to think through it and how it works generally with the credential chain. So if we're going to piggyback off of like the login to a registry, the way that it's done right now, let's say I need to do a Docker operation on a registry, then I would, using the credential chain that's given to whatever entity I'm functioning as, whether that's from my desktop and it's my credentials for my account, or it's from a identity given to one of my pods. Once that identity is there, then I just make a CLI call right now, or it could be an SDK call as well, but a CLI call, and I pass the information in, via password standard in. So you don't ever expose the password and username or whatever. And then basically it's a token that, Docker uses to log in to their registry. And my preliminary testing shows that it also works with ORIS login to the same registry. So I guess what I'm saying is, if this is going to be done via a pod, then the pod itself would have some identity given to it, a credential chain given to it, and then it would be very, cloud provider specific. Like, how do you currently log in with the CLI or SDK for a cloud provider's registry? Because my assumption is that the way that you do that with Docker would be similar to how you do it with ORIS. I mean, at least for my testing, that's how it worked for me. Am I missing something?
Yeah, so the flow is essentially the same. So the username and password that you're using on your CLI, that is also used in the pod after we've done token exchanges to actually get the refresh token, which we use as the password. So at the end, the auth is basically the same, but along the way, the tokens that we used to cache, they might expire, which means we can't actually exchange to get the refresh token from the registry itself to use as the password, or even further up the chain for Azure specific, there's actually 2 token exchanges that happen. So the first one might expire, which will require all of the others to be refreshed. So
at a minimum, it sounds like this is going to be very CSP specific, right? I mean, cloud service provider specific. So, I mean, like on the AWS side, we would, and we talked about these, I guess, a while ago. You guys called them workload identities. But essentially, it's how we give permissions to our pods running in EKS. So once the roles are attached to or annotated onto those service accounts used by those pods, then the credential chain is established. And the SDK within the application running in the pod or the CLI for that matter takes care of the managing or renewing the tokens. But, I can double check on my side, what it's going to require on our side, but it seems like it's very specific to us and you, and perhaps Google. Unless I'm missing something.
I think that's a fair point. Yeah, especially the token exchange part, that is pretty specific to Azure. I don't know how ECR or GCR does it, but I think the general Kubernetes case of having the ability to know when to re-grab the secrets that may have updated, that has to still be addressed, either via we set an expiry or we have a retry operation if it fails, or some active task in the background that's going to check, or some notification if that exists.
So it sounds like that we need to know. So for the target here for, and I don't know, do we have anybody on here from Google? I haven't seen anybody, but I don't really know a lot of people in Google. But so it sounds like at least for Azure and AWS, there's very specific ways that it's going to be done. You know, on our side, I think I have my head around how we're going to do it, but it's AWS specific. So it seems, I guess what I'm saying is it seems like we need to understand the expiry of those tokens and the process to renew those tokens. And then actually, and also the process of how the workloads get identity. Ours is through a IAM role principle that gets attached to the service account used by the pod, that type of thing. So that the credential chain actually attaches. So what I'm getting at is that we need to know the expiry of these tokens and how to renew these tokens. But you know, that kind of goes very cloud provider specific at that point. So I don't know what's common other than maybe an expiry that we purposefully set to, you know, beyond what the expiry is for generally what the token expiry is for each cloud provider. I guess that would be the decision we want to take a look at, right?
Yeah, we can try to distill it down to what is common in terms of expiry and what we can kind of offload to the different providers specifically. So if it's like the Kubernetes provider or like the EKS or the AKS one, maybe we can.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, what I would like, I mean, to me, what I would like to see is, yes, you know, this is, you know, a new layer that we're, you know, attaching to the different registries. But those you know, accessing those registries are already controlled by whatever auth-z or auth-n and auth-z processes that each cloud provider has. So I don't want to reinvent those if I don't have to. So to me, it sounds like if we, I'm wondering if the plumbing is already there is what I'm saying. So the plumbing is already there to say, hey, you know, you are this principal, but your token is outdated. Let's get your token refreshed, or however that works. I would assume that either through the CLI or the SDK, that part works. And if not, we would know what to do when the token is invalid, when we get to, I mean, I know what to do on my side when my CLI no longer works. I just have to refresh my token, but it's very AWS specific. So I would think that we don't try not to be as heavy, you know, not heavy handed is probably not the right word, but try not to dip into that as much as possible and make it very cloud provider specific. Even the expiry is up to what the cloud provider wants. Does that sound functional, or does that sound too generic? I mean, have I missed, because I've just recently started on this, right? But have I missed that there is a project requirement of a specific expiry for tokens?
Maybe what I'm hearing is that we have a reason to at least call out that tokens will expire, because in many scenarios, especially in the case of how we implement it, it is cloud provider specific.
Mhm.
And I'm okay actually not calling out every possible implementation here and let this move on for now. And we can come back to this challenge as we see during integration with the actual stack. So if that's okay, we can hand wave for some time and then come back and see if we have the right extensibility so that we can build on and have the implementations kind of like ironed out over time. Does that sound reasonable?
I mean, I'm not looking to stop what you guys are doing at all. So if you are on the way to already building out an Azure specific set of functionalities, that's fine. You know, as a matter of fact, that's sort of like a Pathfinder effort, and we can go in
Right.
and take a look at what you're doing, and then we can, you know, make it work for the AWS CLI/SDK.
Sounds good.
That's fine with me. All I'm trying to say is the expiry of the tokens for accessing the API, whether it be through the CLI or through an SDK, that to me is up to the individual cloud provider and should be handled the way that any other client would access the cloud provider services. And so we would look to the individual cloud providers to have their institutional knowledge to learn, to know how to do that and what errors to respond to and what the expiry generally is.
Makes sense. So for workload identity, I know that that's the terminology that both GKE as well as AKS or Azure's Kubernetes Service supports. We can kind of follow along that path because there are docs on the Kubernetes side itself to kind of use workload identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So over time, I think let's see how this thing will come up. But Akash, do you have a specific requirement you want to solve at this point in time with respect to refresh? Are you looking for introducing a configuration that would kind of like cause the refresh to happen? Is that's what I'm hearing here?
Yeah, I'm basically searching for the trigger, like what is the trigger that's going to cause it to refresh? Is if right now, if we're don't want to focus too much on this and we don't think this will be as much of a problem, then I think the time expiry is okay for now.
Sounds good.
I can just implement it for the Kubernetes, and then, you know, if we're starting to see issues where people are like, okay,
Sure.
we're updating our secrets pretty often, the
Yep.
basic, maybe we can even configure, like add a field where they.
Yeah. I think just documenting it that this is what's happening and making sure you have logs that indicate that the token refresh happened, that's good enough. And if token refresh fails, you'll know to go back and see your kubectl logs. And that might
Yeah, I
be
mean, if you get it, if you want to proceed and write it to, you know, and build it for Azure, please don't. I mean, I'm not looking to stop that at all. I'm just throwing out some thoughts, but I'm not looking to impede anybody's effort. So if you feel that there's a specific way you want to go and you know it because it's Azure specific and you're familiar with, then by all means. And then I'm going to have separate conversations with the folks here in AWS and then come back to the team with what we think is going to work for us. But I do think it's going to be CSP specific. Sorry to derail the conversation.
No, that's helpful.
This
I
is
mean,
great.
I think we got enough to kind of like say that, yeah, we'll go with something very simple, like a time-based cadence that it'll be documented that once in 24 hours or once in whatever time we decide. And then over time, we can evolve that either as a configuration or as an extension or an extensibility point somehow. I think that seems to be the path I'm understanding here that Akash might take.
Yep. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Akash, you have already logged an item. You can just add the options in the work item.
Okay, sounds good.
The next item we have is Akash has been working on the RSGo v2 migration. So he just had some great updates to share. Go ahead, Akash.
Yeah, so I've been working on that. I was able to get the initial verification flow that we have for our demo to work with the new API. The V2 API gives you a lot more granular control, which is great because the older methods were very like stacked with a bunch of operations, and for our case, some of those are not necessary. What I actually realized was that the old ORS is pretty subject reference specific, while the new ORS allows you to work at the descriptor level. And for us, that works because, for example, like getting the subject descriptor, that's one of our refer store APIs that we implement. And then we stack that with, getting the refers, getting the manifest, getting the blob content. And each of those also take in subject references. So previously, because they were treated individually, we were basically resolving the same subject descriptor reference every single time in every single method. So with ORS v2, you can work at the descriptor level. So now you can kind of separate those two operations. So we can just do whatever the get descriptor returns, and we can just pass that on to the next methods. Same sort of logic for getting the blob manifest descriptor and downloading the blob manifests. So all of those operations can be fine-tuned, so there's no redundancy. Another thing is that the ORS v2 allows you to actually fetch you can provide an artifact manifest descriptor, and it'll go and fetch the actual manifest for that. Previously, what we had to do was use the ORS graph method to actually start from the subject reference, resolve that, take the descriptor, find its refers, and then along that process, it also gets the manifest for each refer, which is a lot of extra overhead that we don't need because we just already have the reference descriptor manifest for the manifest. We just want to download that. So with all of those operations cut out, I'm seeing some pretty significant improvements timing-wise, actually. These are very rough benchmarks, so I'll just caveat that with that. But after 8, 9, 10 tries, starting from a cold startup, I'm seeing about 1.7 seconds as the slowest. So previously it would time out in the worst case scenario, but now worst case scenario I'm seeing right now, it's about 1.7 seconds, which is a pretty sizable improvement. So yeah, I'm hoping like there's some more testing that I have to do, but I'm hoping this is a much better solution. So yeah, the initial thoughts on that.
It would have been nice if you had given me a drop before I did the demo last week.
Yeah, I saw that and I was like, oh man.
Oh well, live demos are always hard.
Yeah. So
do you mind giving the folks who are writing the examples, like Billy and people who are working on the ORAS examples, some feedback?
Yep.
Because I'm guessing you've kind of like already used a lot of the API surface area, right?
Yes, yeah, actually I have a list of a few like nice to haves that I want to pass on to them, because there's a few functions that have changed from the original that now don't support the same functionality exactly. So it'd be nice if we could bake those into.
Sure.
So yeah, I'll also send them my branch so they can take a look how it's being used.
Yeah, I think removing containerd also reduces the CV surface significantly. That's one of the challenges we're seeing over and over again. So once you migrate that, we can drop the necessity to get those CVs passed from Dependabot, right?
Yeah, this is so I'll have more updates next week when I have a more concrete idea on it. I'll do another benchmark analysis to make sure that this is not just fluke and data and that we actually are seeing improvements. So,
cool. So you're using the OCI layout to cache the data now?
Yep. Okay,
cool.
That's also another thing that we didn't have before. We weren't actually using the local ORS cache properly. Or
I have a totally different, I don't know, more like an idea or a question. Can we mount an OCI cache?
Oh, you might be able to, because it distills down to an index file, which you could mount, right? And then you could pass that into ORS, and then ORS would rebuild them.
Correct. So let's say, for example, we are able to pre-populate the cache and mount it on the side. Then it's literally only file access at that point in time. There's no outbound calls at all and no authentication required.
Yep.
Because that was one of the scenarios for Ratify where you wanted to do everything offline and you want to make sure that the validation can happen totally offline in some sense. And that way, if you mount an existing OCI cache to Ratify, all it does is look at local file cache and doesn't need any authentication. I mean, this is for later, but from a scenario perspective, that was one of the goals we wanted to support, because especially in certain environments, you want the signatures all on the box. And that way, as long as it's an OCI layout, everything should just work. Cool. That's really good to know.
Thank you, Akash. The next item, Akash was reading something about Helm chart hooks, and we just wanted to discuss like what are the possibilities with Ratify integration. Let me open this link. Yeah, go ahead, Akash. Like, what are the scenarios that you have in mind?
So this is like a very rough idea. I haven't actually done any deep dive into this to see if it's actually feasible, but after a conversation last week when we were discussing if some sort of Helm pre-validation hook or flow we could use. So I was just looking through the documentation and I saw chart hooks, which allow you to specify like specific triggers in the Helm deployment process where it'll create the sub process and complete the tasks you've assigned, and then it'll continue on. So one of the triggers is like a pre-install hook, which you can, which is basically after Helm renders all the templates, then it'll first call the hook, which will install either a job or a pod into the actual cluster. And maybe if it's a job, we could pre-call Ratify. And so Ratify would do the verification in the hook, and then we would use the verifier cache to store the result. So when the hook completes and then deployment continues, Ratify would already have the verification payload in its cache, and it would just return that. There's a lot of like question marks on whether this would work. So one is like, how would the hook actually get the image that is being deployed? How would it get the name? I'm not sure what the mechanics for that would be. Another question is like, is it possible for the hook to actually call Ratify? What would kind of like the internal networking, would it be possible to call the service? Not familiar with that yet. The other thing is that if it's creating a job or a pod in the cluster as a hook, is Gatekeeper going to block that deployment itself, which means we're back at square one. So yeah, all of these.
I think it's a good start, and that's what you're telling me, right? Like you have an option that you can go down and look at. Installing Ratify is cluster setup or equivalent, right? We don't expect that to happen as a part of the application install. So, but giving it information that, hey, can you make sure that you pre-cache, or you actually you're going to be required to validate this, is something that's worth kind of pursuing. Okay, this is good. I guess is the plan to kind of like investigate this more?
Well, actually, that was the question, whether it's worth investigating this more. Also, the bigger question is that even if this is an interesting option, this is if like all our users use Helm to deploy. If they use like kubectl, then like it totally circumvents this.
Correct.
So yeah, I'm not sure what the plan is. Is it worth investing in a Helm specific solution here?
Can you chat with folks from Helm, like Scott Rigsby, and on the Helm Slack?
Sure, I can message you after to see.
Sure.
Yeah,
I can get you in touch with Scott if you want, and then brainstorm with him as to, hey, is this something that makes sense or not?
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, we have a few more minutes. I just had another clarification on the payload. Like I've seen we have multiple properties called isSuccess. So I just want to bring it up and see, because I was confused about if isSuccess true means we were able to run validation versus the validation result itself is success. Let me bring up a sample response. One of the merged pull request. I've pasted the response. This one. Yeah, so I was testing the cosine plugin, and I've noticed that in the valid signature example, that there is a success property in the verifier report, and there is the same property on the response object. And in the case of invalid signature, the verifier report did say the valid verification failed, but the is success property is missing completely. Sajay, do you have any context on what is success supposed to represent?
So in this case, cosine failed.
The cosine verification failed in this scenario, yes.
What's the HTTP status code that we're getting out of this? Well, do we know what we send back to Gatekeeper? Okay, let me ask you a very simple question. If you run this through Gatekeeper, is it actually passing or failing?
I haven't. I will try it out.
Okay.
But we were looking at the Rego that we were looking for some invalid content string as an error response. So we're looking at the Rego and we suspect that the design is that we want to fail.
Correct. It should be failing here. I'm not following away. So here's the thing. The verifier here, so this is only one verifier, right?
Yes, the cosine plugin.
Okay, name is cosine. So that knows that name is cosine. For some reason, that should fail, and that should fail it's basically like cascading failure. So the innermost result fails and it fails the top, saying that, hey, you failed because of this thing. Because sometimes the SBOM might succeed, but the signature of the SBOM might fail. So here, the cosine signature is failure, and so the final result should also fail. I don't know how it's actually passing. There must be a bug in this. It doesn't make any sense.
So you think is success should be false?
Do we have specification for this? Can we jump back? Can you go to the docs folder?
Yeah, there was a verifier MD file.
Right.
Okay. Code. Should be in the docs. Verifier. Search for.
Yes. So it should be false.
Right, but the language is ambiguous to me because I thought is success could be true if we successfully ran validation on the artifact.
I think the easiest, so here's my thinking. We should always err on the side of failure, especially for verification frameworks. The idea is that by default, you should just fail when you see things you cannot handle. It avoids false positives, especially like you want to err on the side of, I don't know what it is, I'm going to fail you. There are only certain set of scenarios that I will allow to pass is the easiest way to think about it. So I would say we should expect success to be present plus expect it to be true. And if those two conditions are not met, it should be failure by default. So that was one of the things we changed before. So it would be good to kind of like make sure that the property is returned and the property is false by default. Actually, Teja is joining, so she should know this problem very well. So ask her and I'll follow up. I have to join for another meeting, but if Teja is there on the call, please kind of check with her as to what would be the expected outcome.
Yep. Thank you, Sajay. See you later.
Yeah. Teja, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
She has Susan has a very specific question. I think you'll know the answer also.
Oh, I see. Okay.
All right, cool.
Hi, Teja. We have a question on the meaning of is success. Can you see the screen shared?
Yes.
Yeah. And I was validating the cosine plugin with the version bump. So let me bring up the pull request. I think it was that one. That I was doing some validations when the signature is valid and when the signature was invalid. That this is the success payload, so that is success on the response is true, and the verifier report also says is success is true. But when we didn't have a valid signature, there were no is success in the verifier report, but the payload says success is true. Is that is expected?
First of all, consistent payload, that's a bug. If success is written in one result and if success is not written, it's a bug. We should have a consistent schema for the result. Then comes to the e-success, the overall e-success is true or not. I think it depends on whether I have to continue on one failure or all failures. Something along those configurations, there is some check in the code. If I remember, Eric has made that. That's why even if one thing also fails, we still continue and consider as success or something along those lines. Otherwise, it should be fail. It should be false. Because if all of them fail, the entire verification has failed, it should be false.
I see. So in this scenario, there was only one artifact being verified, which is the signature of the cosign. So if
and
that
what's
had
the
failed,
configuration?
the configuration I think had Notary in it, but there was nothing to validate in Notary.
No, I think the configuration for the signature verifier, what was the default? I'm just pulling, there was some setting, right, which determines all or any or something like that.
Yeah, let me bring that up. So I think in the doc for AWS, that's where I was looking at the configuration for cosign. So there is a policy for Notary, but is this policy relevant to cosign signature?
No, because cosign has its own artifact type, right?
Yes.
So the default is all then. The default should be all, right?
Default is all, I see. So, okay, if it's not in the policy, then the default is all. And if one of the signature failed and we require all, then its success should be false.
False, yes. Then that's a bug, I would say, yeah.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, thanks for clarifying this behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it's a bug, then we'll just look into the fix, and I can log an issue to follow up.
Yeah, sure.
Yep. That's everything we have on the agenda. Thank you for joining.
And what did we decide on that cache refresh thing? I know Jimmy had some good points he was talking about.
Yep, go ahead, Akash.
Basically, for the time being, we're just going to implement a time-based solution for the Kubernetes secrets. But
makes sense.
Jimmy was saying, I think we all agreed that we need to, it's a very cloud provider specific task. So it should be offloaded to the cloud provider eventually to handle any sort of refresh, as well as detect if it needs to.
What do you mean by cloud provider here in the context of Ratify?
So I think in the context, so yeah, it's still a little fuzzy, but I think what it would be that the provide method, which is implemented by each cloud provider's auth provider, would be called every single time, and then it's up to the provider itself to determine if credentials are invalid or not and refresh accordingly. Yeah, I'm still a little,
because the cache is managed by Ratify and how does the cloud provider? Let's sort it out. I think let me also think about it right now. There are so many strategies people use, but I think the poor man's solution is time-based. At least it will get refreshed, if not. Forever is dangerous. So we can start with time-based and we can make it smarter.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks.